Following the success of the Oracle games on the Game Boy Color, famously the first mainline Zelda titles to not be developed by Nintendo's core staff, the game's developer studio Flagship, which was a subsidiary of Capcom, Sega, and Nintendo, would be invited to work further on the Legend of Zelda series, and other unrelated projects before the studio's eventual end in 2007. While the main Zelda team were working on the upcoming home console release, the Wind Waker for the GameCube, Flagship would pause the development of their next Zelda effort after being tasked to work on a smaller project that would be bundled in with a reworked port of A Link to the Past for the Game Boy Advance. This smaller project would unexpectedly kickstart an accidental sub-trilogy within the greater Legend of Zelda canon, a timid set of entries, ones that would go on to, in a way, mark a distinct end of an era for the series, a shift that sort of flew under the radar at the time, as did the games themselves. This intro is probably the single best known part of its game. It's as bland as it can get, really. Zelda gets kidnapped by a new foe called Vati, and Link is ordered to go save her from him with the help of the fancy new Four Sword, which splits him in four, because it's a multiplayer game. Four Swords, bundled in with the 2002 Link to the Past port for the Game Boy Advance, as I've said, takes full advantage of the system's link cable functionality to grace its players with an exclusively co-op entry in the series. This does mean that what you have just watched is infamously the only thing most Zelda fans have ever actually seen of the game firsthand, because unless you have at least 2 GBA systems, 2 copies of the game, a specialized link cable, and an extra person willing to play this game with you, you won't be able to proceed past the title screen. That is, unless you're playing one of Nintendo's online re-releases of the game like I did to capture this footage, in which case, it is prone to lag. While it's a bit upsetting that a whole Zelda game was locked in this way for so many people, a sort of silver lining is that it technically wasn't a whole Zelda game. Like, Four Swords is a very, very short game, to be clear. It's divided into a whopping 4 levels and an optional tutorial area. The 4th level only opens up once you beat the first 3 in whichever order you want, which does mean that at the time of its release, this was technically the first non-linear Zelda game since Zelda 1. Very impressive. Each level is split into 2 subsections, followed by a 3rd and final area, which is the level's boss fight. This 3-act sequence generally takes around 20 to 30 minutes, which results in the whole game being beaten in maybe 2 hours on your first playthrough. It's multiplayer. While it still plays like a top-down Zelda game, it does abandon the more holistic labyrinthine level design that you'd be used to, and instead goes for a fast-paced, moment-to-moment obstacle course type feel, which is more suitable for a party game like this. The levels are made up of a set amount of small sections that get randomly reassembled each time you enter. This means that there isn't an actual set layout for any of these levels, and new one gets generated every time you restart, and they get modified depending on how many players there are, which makes the game a lot more interesting to replay. Your task is always just reaching the end platform, which holds a heart container and a warp to the next subsection. To get there, you either have to find keys, or get through a maze, or just through all the obstacles thrown at you. Again, all of this is randomly generated. The levels mainly incorporate the multiplayer into little teamwork puzzles, carrying each other, pulling on an enemy from both sides, a rock or a switch not being able to be picked up or pressed down by one link alone. Honestly, a real highlight is the mechanic of clashing swords against each other to create sparks. It's how you light up torches in this game, and further on gets used in puzzles where you have to shoot arrows against each other to do the same thing, which is honestly just one of the most delightful uses of the bow item in the whole series. Actually, the items in this game are generally okay. You don't have an inventory, so you can only ever hold and use one item at a time. If you want to switch it out, you have to go to these little item pedestals and change it there. It's a decent way of not overcomplicating things while there's multiple players running around with different items each. There are some fun comebacks, like the magnetic gloves or Link's Awakening's Bow Wow of all things. Even the seeds from the Oracle games make a return, though now they act as stat upgrades more than anything. The comeback items are kind of the only ones that this game has, though, all being reused from previous games. All except for one, a hat that makes you small. At the beginning, I briefly mentioned that this game started development after a certain earlier Zelda project of Flagships got temporarily put on hold. It's generally understood that some of the ideas from that game ended up making it here instead. The Nat Hat, as it's called here, is infamously the most likely of being one of those, so put a pin in it. These dark rupees were introduced in this game too, as money that takes your money away, which I don't know what that means for this world's economy, but I mainly just bring them up because they're called rupoors, which is just the best name. Rupee collecting acts both as a competitive element and as the main B-plot for this game. The Rupoors, likes, and especially the newly introduced rupee rates, who suck players' rupees out, exist for the precise reason of making money farming harder. Each level ends with you meeting a great fairy who takes and counts your money, and if you have enough, she'll give you one of the keys necessary to reach Vati. So while you're playing each level, you need to go out of your way to get as many rupees as possible in order to actually progress in the game. It has this folklore Karen of Hades kind of logic going on, which I just find really amusing. It's a pretty normal thing to expect a player to collect money throughout a game, but having it be there to basically pay off a mythic being is such an old fairy tale motif. It's a tiny little thing, but I like it when Zelda games have those loose logic fable kind of stories. I think it's when they work best. The whole rupee farming mechanic is also how the game punishes you when you die. It takes steadily increasing amounts of rupees from you each time you need to get revived, and it's absolutely heartbreaking to watch your money get drained right before reaching the end of a level just because the boss fight completely destroyed you. And yes, these boss fights can actually get reasonably hard. The returning manhandler requires each player to pull its roots out at the same time. It actually takes a lot of fast reflexes to coordinate that while dodging the boss's attacks without also letting the roots slide back underneath it. Even when you're successful, each player needs to simultaneously attack a different part of its weak point when it's stunned, and it really doesn't give you a very long time to assemble for that, so it's entirely possible you'll just miss your chance and have to try again. The what is apparently called Derazol fight in Talus Cave is generally fine once you know what the game wants from you, but it has a final form where the players have to communicate which part of its weak point is able to be attacked by who, as shown on each of their screens, because your screen only shows you another player's attack point. It's a kind of design that you don't really encounter much in other Zelda games just by virtue of them usually being single player, and the boss fights here really make the most of that. Once you get the key from the last great fairy, who actually made me realize that the fairy's name from the Sea of Trees level wasn't a typo. She's the great fairy of the essence of forests. Of forest, not of a forest in particular. Anyway, Vati's Palace, the fourth and final level, opens up. The level plays the way all the others have until now, and I'd say it's probably the tamest one of the four aesthetically, although there will be a reason for that later on. One thing that I haven't really mentioned until now is just how gorgeous this game actually is. It uses the art style from The Wind Waker, despite technically coming out before that game did, but I actually think it looks better than it. There's a specific deliberate quality to sprite art that you don't really get with 3D models. There's dynamic lighting and an unfathomable amount of possible camera angles to account for when working in the third dimension, which means that what's being shown on screen sometimes ends up looking less flattering than intended. This isn't a problem with sprites though, they always look the way that the developers want, making a more consistent look possible overall, which I very much prefer despite the lack of the more grand spectacles allowed in 3D. The colors pop, the lighting and shading of everything is beautiful, especially on objects that are meant to have glossy or reflective surfaces. Like, rupees look great in this game. I'd say the only aesthetic issue I have with Four Swords is the notification feed that appears whenever anything happens during gameplay. I understand why it's there, it lets you know what other players are doing when they're out of sight, but it can intrude on a good chunk of the screen, and sometimes it actually just spoils the solutions to puzzles. As far as I know, there's no way of turning it off, so you're just stuck with it. It's a price you've got to pay for the multiplayer, I suppose. With regards to the co-op, actually, I particularly enjoyed the way this game went about visualizing the different player characters. When making a multiplayer game, the most intuitive thing usually is to just make a few separate characters, likely each with different abilities for the players to choose from. Otherwise, you can also make generic avatars that each player can customize differently. Four Swords goes for what is usually the least inspired solution here by just cloning one character and palette swapping it for each player. It gets away with it though. While Link traditionally wears green, he has been wearing alternate blue and red tunics since the very first Zelda. Depending on the game, they serve as defense, offense, or environmental damage armor. As a result, people intuitively see all three of these as just different established versions of the Link character, not associating any particular ability or power-up with the outfits, just understanding that Link sometimes looks like that. The one new color they did introduce in Four Swords is literally the most obvious one, as the combination of red and blue, which as a little bonus means that the four Link colors here now correlate to the first four rupee colors too. The characters read as what the developers intended, different existing versions of Link rather than cheap reskins of him, which is what they actually are at the end of the day. And I find that to be kind of interesting. You rarely find random multiplayer clones getting adopted as core recognizable characters in a game series, but art of the 4 Links together actually looks really natural. The game comes to a close with a standoff against the Wind Mage Vati. It's odd that they put so much emphasis on him being a Wind Mage specifically, since it's really not that core of a part of him. He's got a tornado attack in the first half of his boss fight, but that's about it. I suppose they needed an element symbol to code his level with, since earth, fire, and water, or ice, I guess, were taken already. The first half of this boss is basically just a glorified Dodongo fight where you throw bombs into him until he gets stunned. It's fine, but it's really just the setup for his second form. Here's where the level goes from the aforementioned tame stone on sky look to this beautiful cosmic background. The fight itself is the most varied in Four Swords, taking vague inspiration from earlier boss fights in this game as well as earlier in the series in general. In fact, his whole design is pretty much just the final boss from Link's Awakening, but whatever. In the story, Vati predictably gets defeated. He's sealed away in the Four Sword, Zelda gets saved, and you get turned back into a singular Link. Cue to the Stray Fairy Rupee collecting minigame during the credits. However, this isn't where the game ends. Since this is bundled in with A Link to the Past, once you finish Four Swords, you can switch back to the port, which I did in my completed save file on my childhood GBA cartridge instead of replaying the game on a system with higher resolution for this video, because I don't like this version of A Link to the Past. The aspect ratio makes no sense. Most infamously of all, they shoehorned in voice lines for Link. They spelled fairy the boring way. Like, why would they do that? Anyway, in the Dark World, you can access a newly added dungeon upon beating Four Swords, the Palace of the Four Sword. It's akin to the added color dungeon in Link's Awakening DX, except here the dungeon actually poses a challenge. It's divided into 4 segmented pathways leading to one of the four swords, each being a linear sequence of puzzle rooms ending in a remixed version of a boss from the base game. The solutions to the puzzles here really expect you to be intimately acquainted with the game's mechanics. One of my favorites here is having to make a block with the Cane of Samaria, picking it up, throwing it on the conveyor belt, and then despawning the block to hit the switch with the block's little projectile attack to open a path forward. Like, this is some really unintuitive puzzle design. The bosses are remixed in this endearingly fan-game-ish way as well. Botula uses bees as an attack now, Blind begins with a vision of your dead uncle, which kind of brings up questions about this palace's place in the canon. Like, how does it know about your uncle? Is it a hallucination? Does Ganon know about it? Because it's in his evil pyramid thing. If the Four Swords are split up, does that mean that the Four Sword is out of its pedestal? Why is it in the Dark World? It was in the Light World in Four Swords. Is the Four Sword even here, or is it just a temple worshipping it? The real answer is obviously that it doesn't matter. It's not actually canon to A Link to the Past, but I think it would have been fun if the game put a bit more thought into how this place fit in the story. Link's Awakening was able to get away with adding a random extra dungeon because the whole game is a dream, so the logic is looser, but here it does clash a bit with the rest of the game. The Palace of the Four Sword ends with a fight against 4 Dark Links with the same attacks as you, each wielding one of the now retrieved swords from the rest of the dungeon, and then the game ends with an alternate Link to the Past ending where everyone in the Dark World just hangs out. Again, what are the canon implications of this? Is there an Ocarina-style timeline split in A Link to the Past now? Since there are Dark Links being fought here, is the Four Sword meant to be evil? The same answer remains. Don't think about it. You can go back to Four Swords and try replaying it on harder difficulties, which is sort of the main idea behind the game. It's as short as it is because you're meant to keep coming back to it as a little party game for you and your friends. It's not really just about beating it. It has a similar philosophy to Star Fox or Kirby's Dream Land in that way. The game has been made available in other formats over the years, most notably the temporarily available Anniversary Edition in 2011, which added extra levels and a reverse-engineered single-player function, which wasn't met with much praise. Four Swords' legacy is very quiet overall. It's considered as more of a novelty than a real worthwhile game that fans should play. It was a restrained little idea that the developers tried out and seemingly didn't really expect to go any further than this. Randomly though, Nintendo saw more potential here and picked it up where Flagship left off, developing a full-length home console follow-up on the GameCube. So in 2004, a Zelda game under the title of Four Swords Plus was released in Japan. It included a main story campaign that functioned as a new canon entry in the series, and then, to properly ham up the whole party game feel, a handful of extra side modes were thrown in as a bonus. Most most notable of these extras being the infamous Navi trackers, included only in the Japanese release of the game, and then being removed for the localized overseas versions. The fact that it was removed for us is literally the only reason why anyone cares about it. Like, it's not actually interesting. I guess maybe it's just a bit mysterious, unless you're Japanese, in which case you're like, oh, that thing. For us lesser folk, the game would be released later under the marginally improved title of Four Swords Adventures, and it would become the lowest selling game in the whole series. Centuries after the first game, in a vaguely Link to the Past inspired setup, a new Link is called down to Hyrule Castle. Then everything goes immediately wrong. A dark entity in the shape of Link appears, kidnapping Zelda and the, again, Link to the Past reminiscent Shrine Maidens. We chase the entity to the Four Sword Sanctuary, which we recognize as the place where Vati was sealed away last time. The Shadow Link watches us unsheathe the Four Sword, which once again splits the hero in four. As we established previously, though, the sword was sealing away the Wind Mage Vati, and by taking it out of the pedestal, we have freed him once again. He blows us away, and the game just unceremoniously starts. Now, from the get-go, it's important to state that Four Swords Adventures puts a bit more emphasis on its story than the first game. Obviously, that's not saying much, but, you know. Here, we establish a mystery around the Shadow Link character, who's back from the Palace of the Four Sword, technically, and an extended MacGuffin hunt with the Link to the Past maidens, on top of Vati returning and all. Right now, it's nothing notable, but when things start getting expanded going forward, do keep in mind that Four Swords Adventures is essentially a party game that you're meant to play passively while hanging out with friends. I should also mention that, yes, this game does continue to echo A Link to the Past pretty much the whole way through. From the music, the graphics, certain story beats, there's the return of a bunch of dungeon locations from that game, and even the Dark World and Moon Pearls. It's all here. It feels like Nintendo were committed to bringing everything from the first Four Swords back in for this game. The original had a bit of a crossover with the Link to the Past port, so Adventures must also have some Link to the Past DNA. The original was on the Game Boy Advance, so Adventures just has to use the GBA as a controller, because yes, for the very few uninitiated, Four Swords Adventures, while a GameCube title, was designed to be controlled by plugging your Game Boy Advance into the console, letting certain sequences be displayed on the GBA screen instead of on the TV. It was a precursor to the likes of a DS or a Wii U. In multiplayer, it opens up extra space to mess around in for each individual player. Like when you enter a cave or a house, it displays that environment on your GBA screen instead of having to change the setting on the main screen for everyone and warping the other players to you or whatever other workaround they would have had to come up with. In single player, which is unfortunately how I'm playing the game, this feature doesn't really add much to the experience. It just loads a new environment for the player, and that's it. Nobody's left behind in the previous part of the level needing a screen to see themselves on, because only one person is playing. The screen switch is completely unnecessary then. They of course didn't just use this two-screen mechanic for that though. Frequently the two-screen function gets used in little gimmicks, like sections of bosses and such. The fight with the Helmarok King, for example, involves you attacking its face on the GBA screen once it crashes through the wall of a cave on the TV. It's a cute idea, the screen switch again being sort of irrelevant in single player, but really this stuff does read more as a developer is just trying to show off how they can do this cool new thing with their console instead of the said cool new thing actually feeling necessary, or even all that mechanically engaging most of the time. It's neat and technically impressive, but it doesn't really introduce any mechanics that couldn't have realistically been implemented in other ways. It also should go without saying that expecting a player to own two distinct consoles and a specific peripheral cable to play one game is kind of a big ask. Thankfully, the game does give you the option to play with a standard GameCube controller. In single player. If you're intending on playing with friends, as is the whole selling point of the game, then the GBAs are compulsory. Multiplayer in Four Swords Adventures isn't accessible otherwise. This single fact is basically what killed the game when it released. Setting it up is just too much hassle, and I honestly don't understand why Nintendo thought it was a good idea to even try selling this at full price, though questioning this company's business decisions is just par of the course at this point, so I guess everything's fine. The GBA mechanic also proved itself an issue in one other way. Graphically, Adventures had to be similar on both the Game Boy Advance display and on the main screen, since you'd be switching between the two regularly. This means that the game, released at the end of the GameCube's lifecycle, was forced to almost exclusively use 2D sprite work for its visuals, similar to the first game. This is nothing but great news for the likes of myself, who absolutely love traditional 2D sprite art in video games. It looks absolutely stunning when done right, as it does in Four Swords, as a reminder. It's the industry's equivalent of hand-drawn or stop-motion animation, and I very much always want to see more of it. But Adventures is clearly uncomfortable with the style. The GameCube is capable of more quote-unquote impressive 3D visuals, so any chance they get, the artists add fancy environmental effects or animations as a way of masking the fact that a lower-res version of this could probably run on an N64. The aesthetic is a bit awkward in general. There's not really a bespoke art style here. Some assets are ripped straight out of A Link to the Past, some out of Four Swords, and some out of Wind Waker. As a side note, a lot of Wind Waker's actual boss fights return in 2D form here. I mentioned the Helma Rock King earlier already. I'd say Jalhala's return is a highlight mainly because of its jump scare attack that actually got me the first time I played it. I actually find it kind of fun that these designs get at least one more time to shine in this, since Wind Waker's bosses seldom get referenced later on in the series. But back to what I was saying, the game's got an unfocused kind of look. It's not necessarily that it looks bad, it just looks wrong. People frequently compared the visuals to that of a ROM hack, and yeah, it doesn't help that the designs original to this game are like noticeably way worse than the reused stuff. It's kind of rough on all fronts in that way. The game can look a bit cheap and uncanny, honestly to the point where I find it kind of endearing. I'm particularly impressed with this in-game art of Shadow Link that just looks like a really low-effort fan edit. But in general, I'd say that graphically the game is fine, and it runs well. It's just that aesthetically it's a bit of a mixed bag. Gameplay-wise, Adventures is pretty similar to the original. This time around, instead of collecting money for a group of demigods, you're collecting the newly introduced and far more boring Force Gems. Tingle makes his grand return here as a sometimes competing collector of these. In the story, the Force Gems are explained away as powering up your sword enough to beat each level, which I guess makes more tangible video gamey sense than rupee fairies, but I just don't like it quite as much. Also, since collecting the Force Gems is compulsory, if you don't have enough at the end of a level, the game just loops you back to get more, and then warps you to the end once your sword is powered up. This particular level is where people tend to encounter the mechanic the most, since the game just locks you in the final room with no way of backtracking, and I honestly kind of love it. Like, it completely breaks the immersion, and it weirdly implies that the Force Sword can time travel. But I guess it's better than you just having to literally replay the whole level as you did in Four Swords. There's a few ways in which the game properly differentiates itself from the original though. Earlier I mentioned that single player is now an option, and I'd say it's implemented alright. You can control the links individually, but most of the time you just play as a single unit with the ability to rearrange into different group formations. It's not the most intuitive thing in the world, but you get by just fine. At the very least, you never feel like you're getting a significantly lesser experience while playing alone, something that co-op Zelda hasn't really been great at doing since. While not an outright change, the game is much longer than Four Swords, being divided into 8 sections all containing 3 separate levels. Each of the 8 sections are basically the length of the entire first game, making Adventures pretty lengthy in comparison. It'll most likely take a good 10 to 15 hours to beat on your first time around. While I do think that the game eventually overstays its welcome a bit, the runtime doesn't really feel padded out at all. The environments are varied, and there's a good amount of random one-off mechanics thrown around the level so that it never feels like the game is running on autopilot. Horse riding is brought over from 3D games for a short section, there's a stealth sequence, little mini-boss run-ins with Shadow Link, that moving flamethrower house exists, which is something that the first game didn't really have. The main thing differentiating those levels was really just the theming. As I've said already, the story is also a bit more fleshed out this time around. The original Four Swords mainly left you to your own devices once the game itself started, making the randomized levels not really interfere with anything. Adventures, on the other hand, opts for fully developed, unchanging levels, except to accommodate for the number of players, that is, which all have little narratives that direct you towards doing whatever it is that you need to be doing instead. Bring a letter to this character, take Malin on an escort mission, help the Gorons, who look really ugly in this game. Again, visuals aren't great. It's not dissimilar to the little dungeon preambles in more standard Zelda games. In those, it works because Zelda generally has a slower, more explorative playstyle, so wandering around looking for clues or talking to random NPCs just is what the game is sometimes. But Four Swords Adventures is going for a fast-paced party game kind of feel, which means that breaks in momentum like these just end up annoying the player more than anything, especially when you're with friends and you're only sort of paying attention to what's happening on screen. It is true though that the game still follows that obstacle course type design from the first Four Swords, meaning that you get a bit more action and moment-to-moment puzzle solving in out-of-dungeon settings than you would in traditional Zelda. The developers accounted for the faster pace of this game, but just maybe not as hard as they could have. The design in general is is a bit less polished than you'd expect. You can make this bomb escape sequence just despawn by leaving the room, the game plays the damage animation twice in a row when you fall in the pit, and there's paths rudimentarily blocked off until you speak to an unrelated plot dump character, at which point the path arbitrarily opens up. It's just simple things that Nintendo usually avoids. And yeah, plot dumps. Obviously, I have to preface this by saying, no, I don't expect Zelda games to be anything they're not. Nintendo is an almost exclusively family-friendly company, so things can't get too interesting. The darker stuff is frequently implied rather than outright shown. Zelda 2's infamous game over state, where Ganon is revived by getting his ashes sprinkled with Link's blood, definitely doesn't happen on screen every time you die. It's explained in the manual, and that's it. I did briefly mention something earlier while talking about the first four swords. Zelda's plot usually gets away with a lot more, and just in general works best, when it leans further into the folklorish fairy tale direction than the more classic high fantasy one. It's how the series started, really. Thou hath musteth defeat the beast by playing your flute. The maiden's been cursed to sleep forever, that kind of stuff. Even Ocarina of Time, while generally going more for that epic fantasy feel, when boiled down, it still works on this core serendipitous kind of dream logic. Kid wants to save the world with the prophecy sword, but oh, he's too young to wield it, so he falls asleep at the hilt until he's old enough, and then he can save the world. Now that it's all ruined and evil. It reads a bit like an old myth, and I think that's intentional. Link's Awakening, and especially Majora's Mask, would be the best examples of how macabre themes are allowed to exist here when sewn into this fable Alice in Wonderland kind of framing. But again, that's not to say that these games are some narrative masterpieces. They are not. I'm just saying that there are ways in which they can work. Four Swords Adventures, in my opinion, doesn't work. There's the hunt for Force Gems on top of whatever the level-specific B-plot is. Then, after every 3 levels, you reach one of the Shrine Maidens, which is the game's main MacGuffin hunt. Rinse and repeat 7 times, and then 1 extra time for the finale. This would be a general equivalent of the original Four Swords' quote-unquote plot. But Adventures extends it further. There's the game-long objective to defeat Shadow Link, or Links, who come from the Dark World through the Dark Mirror, which you are searching for. The Shadow Links help Vati, but are generally working independently of him. Reaching Vati himself is blocked by another MacGuffin hunt that's happening concurrently with everything else. This is of course collecting the so-called royal jewels from possessed Hylian knights who you must exercise of demons in boss fights. This is on top of the ever-present rumblings of one mysterious Ganon, or Ganondorf, who has stolen the evil trident from Pyramid and is seemingly building an army to destroy the world, and also is lore-wise a separate Ganon character to the old Ganon character who was killed in, like, Zelda 1, I think. This game was most likely meant to be a prequel about the imprisoning war, but then they realized they did that already, so they made it a sequel to the games where Ganon is dead. So they had to write themselves out of that. Could this reincarnation of Ganon possibly be the mastermind behind Vati? Stay tuned. The plot is cluttered and way too high concept for what this game is. There's also no shortage of just sort of poor one-off level subplots, like the infamous village of the Blue Maiden and its fat lady character who you need to physically push out of your way because laugh. Now, the game doesn't exactly endear itself to you. With so many sub-objective plot devices and like 15 simultaneous antagonists, you just kind of turn your brain off eventually. You watch these scenes pass you by having no idea what's even going on half the time because, again, you're meant to be playing this with friends, and nobody actually cares about the plot. You just want to play a game together. And for as much as I'm whinging right now, it's interesting to see all this get executed weirdly successfully, just not in-game, but of all things, as a graphic novel. A duo of manga writer-illustrators going by the singular pen name of Akira Himekawa are the minds behind, amongst other projects, Nintendo's official Zelda manga adaptations. They have a pretty neutral reputation among Zelda fans. Like, the manga tends to be seen as a fun novelty at best, and at worst as something you just don't really think about that much. The manga isn't canon. It pretty frequently strays from the source material, which of course means fans get very, very opinionated over some of it. But one of these adaptations is viewed as towering over the others, revered as the most okayest one of them all. The really long Twilight Princess one. but people generally like the Four Swords one as well. The thing that this manga does best is that it focuses more on the characters than the core plot. Link's personality traits get divided among the 4 different versions of himself, which obviously isn't really a thing in the game. There's the angry one, the vaguely queer-coded one, the evil one. It allows there to be some sort of character arc for the group, starting with animosity between the Links and then ending with them all warming up to each other. It's pretty standard stuff, but it does add to the narrative flow of things, which isn't really in the game. Shadow Link is also given an actual character. In-game, he's just a goofy little mini-boss with no personality. In the manga, though, he's given your standard misunderstood villain type storyline. He tries recruiting Purple Link to the dark side at one point, only to have his redemption arc kickstarted when he gets betrayed by him. He's the one who explicitly turns the Hylian Knights evil in the manga, the Knights being people Link knows this time around. One of them is his father, actually, which adds a bunch of extra drama to that part of the story. Like, the Knights were just random NPCs that you couldn't care less about in the game. This is nothing but an improvement in my opinion. One thing that's pretty interesting is how the manga kind of just ignores the whole dark world, light world switching from the game. The mechanic works a lot different to the way it did in Link to the Past. Here, from the lore standpoint, it's barely explained. There's just portals around because I guess Shadow Link crossed from there to here using the Dark Mirror or something. It also doesn't really have the whole evil aesthetic anymore. Really, it just exists as an excuse to include more GBA screen switch puzzles while playing. The manga in general weaves the plot together way better. In the game, you save and team up with Zelda at the end, and Shadow Link just goes away when you and her find the Dark Mirror in the most anticlimactic way possible. In the manga, Shadow Link's redemption arc is in part about him resenting Vati, so he himself breaks the Dark Mirror to weaken Vati and help the Links out in beating him. It lets Shadow Link have his little hero's death scene with all 4 Links accepting him, and it gives the final battle a bit more of an emotional build-up. In the game, there's basically nothing like that. There, you go through the Palace of Winds level, which has that one puzzle where you throw a boomerang through a wall. Everyone who's ever played this game has this room seared into the backs of their eyelids, I swear. He has even less personality this time around than in the original Four Swords, the game not even giving him the dignity of dialogue. Since you switch between the main and GBA screens throughout the fight, it actually just makes Vati seem even less threatening, being represented with this goofy little sprite on the smaller screen. He dies the same way any other boss in the game would, and it's predictably revealed that Vati was not in fact the true final boss, but that Ganon had been behind it all along. The same plot twist that a solid 3 Zelda games had pulled prior to this. The final Ganon fight is preceded by a little escape sequence where you and Zelda are making your way back down from the crumbling tower, which is a clear repeat of the same sequence in Ocarina of Time. And honestly, this is a good time as any to just address the fact that this game is kind of ridiculously derivative of previous titles in the series. Obviously, it's a follow-up to the first Four Swords game, so it largely plays similar to that. But even outside of this, the game just brings nothing new to the table. Some returns and callbacks are fun. A personal favorite of mine is how the game brought back the mechanic of big keys being used for big chests, something that's been missing from the game since these items were introduced in A Link to the Past. But most of the returning material just clogs up the game and prevents it from having any real identity of its own. Visually and audio-wise, it's mainly just a mashup of previous games' assets. As mentioned, the game echoes A Link to the Past the whole way through, its main premise basically just being the second half of the game, but with Vati from Four Swords briefly thrown in. Obviously, Zelda games build on each other. They are a series after all. Even Ocarina, one of, if not the most important Zelda game, reused a huge amount of ideas from the titles that came before it. Its reuse of the core Link to the Past plot structure is trite to even bring up at this point. Returning bosses and their mechanics are pretty close to being the only ones the game has to offer. Even the iconic Twin Rova boss is basically just a combination of 2 earlier fights. Magical flutes have been part of the series since the very first game. The blue Ocarina flute design originates again from A Link to the Past, and the idea of collecting different songs for the ocarina that all do different things originates from A Link's Awakening. So the core ocarina concept from Ocarina of Time wasn't even original, but despite this, the game introduced so many mechanics and bits of lore and obviously brought the series into 3D. It balanced out the old with the new that way. Four Swords Adventures introduces a second screen? Well, actually, it didn't even do that because there was already a Zelda for the Game & Watch that did. By the time you reach the final Light Arrow battle against Ganon alongside Zelda, a mechanic lifted from the Wind Waker, the game just begins to evaporate from your brain. The most memorable part about the Ganon fight is probably the ridiculous little skeleton dimension he transports you to every once in a while. To be fair, the Ganon fight is one of the times where the manga is actually weaker than the game. There's literally only 9 pages between Ganon appearing and him dying. The art's nice though. After this, the game is over. We have our little scene of putting the Four Sword back for chronologically the final time in the series, and that's that. It's a bit disheartening how there's seriously almost nothing that this game can call its own, which, considering the fact that it's not exactly amazing at the things that it does lift from elsewhere, just makes things even more miserable. The game, more so than any Zelda title that came out before, just felt like filler. I'd hazard a guess that Nintendo didn't really care about what they were making here. They just wanted a game that made use of the GameCube's GBA interactivity, and that's it, really. It's upsetting because the original Four Swords was such a cute, inoffensive little game that knew exactly what it was, and its reputation is now retroactively overshadowed by this game just because it's the one released on a home console, and also not bundled in with the remake. I'd say it's ironically the least worthwhile installment in this little miniseries. The fact that it was on a home console and also the only one directly developed by Nintendo didn't really help it in the grand scheme of things. And what really didn't help this game's reputation is actually what immediately followed. The third and final game in this little trilogy serves as a prequel to the first two, actually opening by telling us the origin myth behind the sword that'll eventually become the Four Sword. It was the return of Flagship, and was also the last Zelda project that they ended up working on. As the most traditional Zelda out of the three, it gets rid of the multiplayer mechanic, and gone too is the Four Swords in the title, the game notably instead going by Minish Cap. The reason I'm describing this game in the most roundabout way possible is because this is the project that Four Swords disturbed the development of all the way back in 2001. Technically, this is the first Four Swords game, not just timeline-wise, but actually the first to begin development. Which ideas originated here is impossible to know, but it's pretty certain that at least a lot of the art and assets began their life here rather than in Four Swords. It's something that really makes you see this game in a different light, so just keep it in mind as we go forward. The game starts, as many Zelda titles do, with Link waking up and being told to go to Hyrule Castle, this time accompanied by Zelda herself. There's a festival in town involving a big ceremony where the so-called Picori blade, the sword from the prologue, is displayed. You, as the blacksmith's apprentice, have to bring it to the castle so it's ready for the winner of the festival's competition to touch it. There's a short section here where you get to walk around the festival with Zelda and kind of soak in her personality. She's portrayed as really bubbly. For the first time in the series, she actually has a previously established friendship with Link here. It makes this whole intro feel a lot cozier than previous games. Link feels more like a real part of this kingdom, and if anything, Hyrule in general feels more like a small town with a close-knit community where everyone knows everyone else, regardless of class or whatnot. You can see people at the festival treat Zelda like a normal person, and even lovingly poke fun at her at one point without getting jailed or executed, so that probably means something. The game generally does a good job at endearing you to its world before you get sent off to save it, which, speaking of, the winner of the festival's competition is of course revealed to be Vati, still in a humanoid form here, yet to turn into the whatever we know him as in Four Swords and onwards. He stabs the Picori blade in half, unleashing everything it was sealing away, and then turns Zelda to stone. Oh. He's searching for the so-called light force, but he doesn't fight it here, and so he disappears, and we pass out. Yeah, Zelda, as much character as they tried establishing for her in the beginning, just gets shoved into the damsel in distress MacGuffin role again. The same as with the previous two games. Link wakes up in Hyrule Castle and gets sent off to restore the Picori sword by bringing it to the titular Picori, these being a race of tiny beings who live in the woods and who were the ones described as coming down from the heavens at the beginning of the game. The Picori are additionally explained to be invisible to adults, which is such a delightfully arbitrary explanation for why Link is the one sent out instead of the 50,000 soldiers they have running around. Once we get to the woods, we find a character named Eslo, a grumpy talking hat who functions as this game's companion for Link, sitting on his head instead of Link's traditional green cap. Technically, you could say that Adventures had Capora Gapora sometimes, and the first Four Swords maybe had the Great Fairies, which I actually find strange that it took that long for those to become a main companion character in a Zelda game, considering they've literally existed since the very first one. And even then, they're not really companions in the traditional sense, but never mind. Eslo is a proper Navi-style supporting character, and what he adds to the game is his power to shrink. This is the tie to the Four Swords Nat hat I was talking about earlier. Again, we can't say for sure that it started off as a concept during this game's development, but it is definitely implemented more here. In Four Swords, it's only ever used to walk through really clearly marked holes in walls. Here, you've got whole close-up sequences where you wander around tiny areas. Later on, being small allows you to talk to animals, as well as get hurt by them, and most importantly, it helps you communicate with the Picori. We come across their village and find out that to reforge the Picori blade, we need need to infuse it with the 4 elements that are hidden around Hyrule, these being represented by the 4 level symbols from 4 Swords, by the way. And one of these elements happens to be in the dungeon conveniently right next to this village. It's a quick little pre-dungeon intro that establishes all the main components of the story well enough. The only thing I don't love is the short side mission to find the Jabbernut, which allows Link to understand the language of the Picori, or the Minish as they prefer to call themselves. It's just one of those things. I really dislike it when a story waves language barriers away like that. It's just way less interesting than if it were made into an actual plot point. I don't expect there to be a year-long sequence where Link stares at a dictionary or something like that. I just think it would have been more interesting to maybe have Eslo translate what the Picori say, since it was established he understands them, and he'll also be around for the whole game. Really, anything would be better than establishing a language only to write it out of the story immediately after introducing it. In any case, we do briefly see their language in text boxes, and their words all seem to end in either O or I, which also carries over to their names. This will become important a bit later on. The first dungeon, while straightforward, does teach the basics of the game well, and it hides its tutorializing behind a really strong aesthetic. This blue and green color palette looks great, and the central puzzle motif of rotating a barrel around is one of the more memorable ways the game themes its levels around you being small. The crowning achievement of this here, however, comes with the dungeon's boss fight, which is actually just a regular-sized choo-choo enemy that you've got to fight in Minish form. It's not a particularly amazing fight, but the concept's memorability more than makes up for it. You can tell the developers were really proud of it too. There's art of the sequence in the game's credits, and a remixed version of the boss itself comes back in a later dungeon. That same dungeon features another boss fight against a regular-sized enemy too. This time it's against an Octorok, which you accidentally defrost. The Temple of Droplets level is an interesting subversion of the classic dungeon formula in a lot of ways. It hands you a big key at the very beginning, and you actually find the dungeon's MacGuffin right away. Your time is instead spent trying to melt the ice around the elements so you can get to it, but that leads to the aforementioned boss fight. Since I did it with 4 Swords Adventures, I might as well do it here too. Minish Cap also has a manga adaptation. This one isn't received quite as well as the 4 Swords one, and the changes it makes, instead of improving the source material like the 4 Swords manga did, just confuse the reader more than anything. The Temple of Droplets section, for example, is changed to be a live vocal performance by a fairy who is to die once she finishes singing. This is explained to be a repeating tradition, and I guess this species of fairy just works like that. I actually quite like this as an idea. It taps into that folklorish feel again, but I can't help but think that this comes out a bit out of nowhere, especially when Vati attacks midway through and turns her into a moth, making her live forever. You know, like moths do. The Octorok encounter is moved to earlier in the story, right after Link gets shrunk down for the first time, and the choo-choo fight is removed completely. In the manga, Deepwood Shrine, the first dungeon, instead culminates in a fight against these mushroom enemies, which are just random filler encounters in the game, but I guess they tie more into the fancy new Gust Jar item, so they showed that off here instead. Festari, a Minish that you meet before the first dungeon, who can speak the human language, gets promoted a bit here to help out more, which, again, I like in theory, but they make him this human fetishizer weeaboo analog, which is just a joke that goes nowhere. There's also a random allusion to Christianity when we first meet him, and it's not the only one either, which leads to that awkward question of, like, do the Hylians believe in Jesus? Or do they believe in the gods that we know they believe in? Back in the game, we get our first element, and I commend the restraint to not make the first MacGuffin be the green one. The following area has us scaling a mountain in search for the Minish blacksmith who can help us restore the Picori blade. It's here where the game's commitment to that 4 Swords level design becomes more obvious. Many of the pre-dungeon build-up sections in this game followed that obstacle course type of design that one wouldn't traditionally associate with Zelda games. It felt like an intuitive workaround in the prior multiplayer games, but it actually comes off as a fresh spin on the formula here, since the game plays much closer to a standard Zelda. I'd say this aspect of Minish Cap's design was more so inspired by the 2 previous titles rather than having originated here. Scaling this place is essentially a mini dungeon of its own, finding your way around the caves, around the level's layout, moving this seed to one place and needing to water it with a specific spring water from elsewhere in the area. There are minimal NPC interactions here, it's just environmental puzzles and a bit of combat. Very much unlike the more traditional build-up to the first dungeon. In fact, later pre-dungeon build-ups would go even further with this and construct little collectathon maze levels using the newly introduced kinstone pieces. These are generally a streamlined side quest tool. They're represented as halves of a metal shape that you find around as collectibles, and when approaching an NPC who also has one, you get the option to try slotting your kinstone pieces together. If they are compatible, they fuse and magically cause some change in the overworld as a reward. This can be something as simple as causing a door to open or a chest to appear, but can also outright force an NPC to act work differently, which is a bit unsettling when you think about it for too long. It's such an ex machina feature, like there really isn't a limit to what these can or cannot do, and what's best is that they are never really explained. They're basically really reliable good luck charms in the canon, I guess. Their effectiveness is based on which color they are, following the same pattern as rupees do, because of course, every one of these 3 games just needed some unique rupee-colored collectible in them. Sometimes though, the kinstones are mandatory items. These ones are gold, and they're mainly used as keys in those aforementioned open mini-dungeon maze sections slotted before a main temple. It's actually odd how they just sort of get forgotten about by the end of the game. It seemed like there should have eventually been some explanation for them, but it never comes. They realistically don't affect the plot at all, so I don't fully know what they were going for with them, but I think they're fun, so I don't really mind. We find the Minish blacksmith, who in the manga has an added backstory about a dead wife. Notice how all the manga-only woman characters just exist to die. He begins working on the sword, and we go look for the second element in a nearby cave. It's here where I should probably mention one of the things that sticks out the most to me about Minish Cap, and that's just how organically the game's story moves along. Upon securing the fire element in this dungeon, alongside its horrifyingly named item, the Cane of Patchy, it's pronounced patchy, we receive the refurbished sword from the blacksmith, and we're off to fuse it with the elements ourselves. This starts giving it some of its 4 sword powers, and allows it to split us in 2. Presumably, we'll get more copies available with each new element added. The fact that the sword refurbishing, the element hunting, and the 4 sword powering up are essentially 3 separate tasks slowly spread out and established throughout the first 2 dungeons, and a bit, is actually really unorthodox. In other Zeldas, the crucial plot stuff would all be dumped on the player before they even set foot in a dungeon, but this game gives it a bit more time to breathe. In fact, the following dungeon doesn't end up even having an element at the end at all. We find that it's been moved, which is probably the only time a Zelda game has done something like that, have Link stumble into a dead end in a story. It makes the plot feel more fluid, like there's a natural push and pull to the quest going on here, instead of it just being a checklist for you to incrementally tick off. The big new concept in this dungeon is climbing inside of automatons as a Minish to either shut them off or power them on. The mechanic is established on the path to the dungeon, but is brought all the way through to the boss of the temple, where you've got to climb inside of its mouth to damage it. It's actually a mechanic brought over from Four Swords Adventures, where I do think it was executed a bit better, since the extra shrinking mechanic wasn't a part of it. The fact that you can't change size at will in the Minish Cap the way you could in the first Four Swords does hinder the design a little bit. You need some kind of environmental object with a small opening in it to change size, which means that if there's one of these little portals around, you know that whatever the solution to the upcoming puzzle is, it'll involve shrinking. It takes away from the puzzle solving and also affects the pace of a fight that includes the shrinking mechanic like this one does, because you're constantly running over to the pedestal and mashing the A button to skip the animation. The four-sword clone mechanic has a similar problem actually. You can only temporarily clone yourself by charging your sword on these glowing tiles, which again means you know what the solution is every time you come across them. It's most likely that this cloning mechanic was introduced into Minish Cap after it had already been in the multiplayer games, but it definitely feels like a prototype for what it would eventually turn into. It's clunkier to execute, there's no way of changing formation, and the links just directly repeat what you do, unlike in the single-player version of Four Swords Adventures, and obviously very different to the multiplayer, but that goes without saying. In the manga, this whole section is completely skimmed over. The story instead goes straight into the Temple of Droplet sequence. This is most likely due to the aforementioned fact that this dungeon doesn't technically push the story forward in the traditional sense, which I understand, but is still one of those cute parts of the game that the manga just doesn't really capture very well. The adaptation misses the atmosphere of Minish Cap in general. While there are quieter moments here, it mainly just focuses on the action, which isn't really what the game is remembered for. Link is also depicted as a complete asshole, especially at the beginning while hanging out with Zelda. Then, once he gets the shrinking ability, he instantly uses it to perv on a girl under her skirt. I get it's played for laughs, but it really doesn't set the protagonist up as being particularly likable. In the game, Link is like a pathetically kind character. I mean, he returns a bunch of books to the library as part of the main storyline at one point. Like, this version of him is not meant to act like this. They sort of awkwardly try to make Vati more sympathetic in the manga. We find out in-game that both Vati and Eslo were once Minish, and that Vati, with the power of this all-powerful hat, turned himself into the form we know him as now, and transformed Eslo, his mentor, into the the Cap that we know him as. This is where the Minish language comes in, by the way. They gently foreshadowed that both these characters are originally Minish because the language's words and names are all shown to end in either I or O, as Vaati and Eslo do. In the game, Vaati is really one-dimensional. He's just looking for whatever the light force is meant to be, and that's all we really know of him. But in the manga, he is implied to be driven by the need to prove himself to Eslo, who was too strict as a teacher. And then they give him this last-minute redemption arc where he turns back into a Minish and lives with Eslo again. Even though we know that Vaati stays an evil wind mage monster thing and actually dies at the end of Four Swords Adventures, so that literally makes no sense. Returning to the game, after getting the water element in the Temple of Droplets that I mentioned earlier, Link gets a vision of the past king of Hyrule telling him to meet him where he is buried. This is your last chance to go save this character, accessible through an early Kinstone portal before you reach this area as intended in the main story, at which point this character will have straight up died. You've got to suck the ghost around him into your jar, and then he'll reward you with the light arrows, which are as a result one of the only missable items in the whole series. If the NPC dies, there's no other way for you to get them. The ghost is also represented by the rupee rate sprite from Four Swords, which I always thought was a cute callback. Well, or call forward. Again, I don't technically know whether it originates in Four Swords or in here. Optional content in this game generally revolves around the Kinstone fusing mechanic. The other main side quests are training to unlock different sword techniques and collecting seashells which are returning from Link's Awakening, though they are used for an absolutely horrible luck-based figurine minigame here, which I don't even touch this time around because I do actually value my time on this earth, as shocking as that may sound. Otherwise, you've got your standard heart piece collecting, which, since there are only 5 dungeon heart containers in this game, you'll find heart pieces absolutely everywhere here. The abundance of these collectibles and little explorable extra areas really positively balance Minish Cap out because the game is otherwise really linear. Most infamously before the 3rd dungeon, where the game doesn't even let you attempt to start the Shoemaker sequence until you triggered the notification that the Pegasus boots will be needed in the Castor Wilds area. So the little surface level detours here are definitely welcome. Link ends up following the Ghost King's directions into the Royal Valley, which acts as Minish Cap's Lost Woods section. I actually really like the way this part of the game looks. The art of the dead trees and the overall color palette just fits this art style really well. I'm also partial to the way these Cyclops ghost enemies die with the big cartoonish X's over their eyes. We find a graveyard and enter the Royal Crypt, which is this game's one and only mini dungeon. Real emphasis on the mini. It's only 5 rooms and it hilariously ends on the same exact combat encounter that it starts with. We speak to the Ghost King, who sends us to the Cloud Tops to meet up with the Wind Tribe, who should have the wind element. This is where we get our second little Kinstone Collectathon maze section, and we enter the last elemental dungeon, the Palace of Winds. This is the lengthiest dungeon in the game, and it's very much meant to be the same palace from the previous 2 games. It seems that Vaati was originally intended to be part of the Wind Tribe instead of the Minish. Their element is the one that gets the most attention, their dungeon is where Vaati resides in the other Four Swords games, and he is literally referred to as a wind mage. Like, it's clear that there were some last-minute changes to the story here. The game puts a lot of emphasis on the fact that the Picori, their blade, and the light force come from the heavens, meaning that the Minish and the Wind Tribe might have been one and the same at some point in development. I have no real evidence that this was ever the case, but it just seems odd how the Wind Tribe have very little to do in the game otherwise, and how many ties there are between them and Vaati. It's possible that something similar to this was the plan for the story at the beginning until Four Swords came around and halted this game's development, forcing them to maybe mix things up a little more than they already did, but again, I have no proof. The Palace of Winds introduces our last dungeon item, the Rock's Cape, which allows Link to jump. It's at this point where the Link's Awakening style issue with item mapping really starts getting a bit overwhelming. The game only allows the player to have 2 items available at any particular time, which means that there will be a lot of menu scrolling as you switch from one item to another during the game. It was understandable in Link's Awakening, considering the hardware limitations. It was frustrating in the Oracle games, since they came out almost a full decade later, and by the time Minish Cap came out, it was absolutely unacceptable. The console has more buttons than the previous Game Boys, so why the game refused to utilize them is beyond me. It doesn't ruin the game or anything, but it definitely affects the experience. Another little returning Link's Awakening motif in this dungeon is the appearance of Mario enemies. We get Lakitu for whatever reason, I guess to mirror the Chain Chomp reference in Four Swords maybe. The boss fight here is against the so-called Georg pair, implying a connection between these and the fight from Majora's Mask. They are 2 flying stingrays who you ride and fight fight simultaneously. It's honestly one of the most interesting boss set pieces in the whole series. It's the first time that a boss fight requires use of the four-sword cloning mechanic. It's how you attack the larger Gjorg's weak spot here. It's obvious what needs to be done by virtue of the glowing tiles here, but it's still good that they managed to use the mechanic for a dungeon boss like this. After getting the wind element, we at last mend our sword to the fullest in Sanctuary, and the game finally starts calling it the four-sword. This part is the one thing I actually prefer in the manga. Link, being a blacksmith's apprentice, gets completely dropped in the game after the intro, whereas in the manga they actually tied back into the story by having Link forge the elements into the sword with the help of the Minish blacksmith from earlier. It's such an obvious plot beat that now it just feels like it's missing from the game, having seen it in the manga adaptation. With the Four Sword, we now gain access to the full origin myth of the Picori Blade and the Light Force, and a full view of the stained glass window it's written on, which I myself appreciate because it looks gorgeous. It plays the epilogue from the beginning of the game, with one final added section revealing that, gasp, the Light Force Vaati is searching for has been inside of Zelda this whole time. Vaati hears this and instantly goes all out, taking over Hyrule Castle in search for Zelda. This kickstarts the final dungeon, which is honestly one of the best in the whole series. Zelda games post-Link to the Past sort of began treating the final levels more as just build-ups to the final boss than letting them be their own levels like they were in the first three. Four Swords and Adventures technically didn't fall into the same habit by virtue of those games not really being able to afford to not make a level, but Minish Cap is a comeback of that classic fully realized dungeon experience that ends the game off, which I personally could not be happier about. Dark Hyrule Castle is split into two acts. In the first, we make our way through the bottom levels of the castle, saving the few Hylians who Vaati turned into stone while taking over. One of them being the king, who we save from a prison cell. I actually like this little final narrative beat here. It actually makes the plot feel like it's still moving along, and not just waiting for you to finish the dungeon before a boss can happen, even though that is still what's actually happening here. The second act has us climbing further up into a maze of Darknut encounters, which forms a key gathering level required to reach the dungeon's big key. It also dips its toes a bit into that Oracle game's color puzzle design too, which comes off more as a fun little callback here than as questionable and repetitive of a choice that it did in those games. Before we reach Vaati, we need to get through a small scripted set of combat sequences, while Zelda's Light Force is dramatically getting sucked out of her. It's ironic because this tiny 3-room long section is basically the equivalent of what the final mini-dungeons were in the Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. Kinda just puts Minish Cap's finale into perspective that way. What follows is a 3-phase final boss fight with Vaati, which pleasantly goes out of its way to use most of your arsenal one last time before the game wraps up. The final phase is also probably the most obvious showcase of how inelegantly the shrinking and cloning mechanics were implemented into this game. You have the main villain warping you into an alternate universe arena, which just so happens to have both the glowing four-sword tiles and the Minish shrinking portal on either side of the screen. It's not a huge problem, don't get me wrong, but it definitely would have been better if the players had to think to use these mechanics themselves during the fight, rather than the game just blatantly spoiling the solution like this. It's mainly not too big of a problem because this fight sequence is one of the few times that a final boss in this series actually poses a decent challenge. The game doubles down on Adventures' reuse of the post-free Zelda escape sequence, which lets you stock up on health or ammo between the second and third phases of Vaati's fight, and chances are that most players will desperately need that help here. I'm actually going to use this as an excuse to mention this game's music here. During Vaati's final phase, the music features a sort of solemn rework of the main Zelda theme. The game has been playing around with this motif throughout its whole runtime. The main theme of the game actually has nothing to do with the main Zelda tune. The Minish Cap's signature theme is what you hear on the title screen. But it's woven into the main Zelda theme and reworked throughout the game so much that your brain can't really tell where one ends and another begins. You just immediately know it's from Minish Cap. There's what probably counts as the Minish theme, which itself is reworked and woven into the Dragon Roost Island theme from Wind Waker of all things. Having notable music at all is refreshing after the pretty lacking soundtracks of the first two games, but Minish Cap really pulls its weight here. The straightforward remixes of old tracks are also great, probably the most beloved being the Hyrule Castle rework. The main melody is the same as it always is, but it's built on top of a different repeating riff with different chords that gives it this dire, almost sad tone. The game ends as you'd expect. Vati gets defeated. In the manga, he gets that half-hearted redemption arc after the Light Force upsettingly begins to break him from the inside. This isn't in the game, but I do like it, even though it's only there for like half a page. Eslo changes into his regular form, Zelda wishes everything back to normal using the all-powerful hat, and Link says goodbye to his companion forever. Again. These three games, Four Swords Adventures, and Minish Cap, occupy a quiet, liminal space in the Zelda series. Up until this point, the games kept chiseling away at what the definition of a Zelda game is, sort of allowing the series to grow from one game to another. Zelda 1 is obviously the origin point. Link to the Past created what would eventually be known as the traditional Zelda formula. Ocarina of Time refined that formula and brought it into 3D, and Wind Waker introduced the open-ended island-hopping type of traversal, which would be replicated, or at least in some way influenced, future games. Four Swords and theoretically Minish Cap, since, again, the two games have a sort of nebulous development chronology, made a tiny step of their own with establishing the multiplayer Zelda setup, one which the upcoming co-op games would follow. The series' growth got stunted here, however. 2002's Wind Waker was a divisive game, and it feels like it made Nintendo unsure of themselves in a way that they hadn't been before when it comes to Zelda. Four Swords was out since before Wind Waker, and Minish Cap was midway through development now. Four Swords Adventures was most likely released in part to stall for time before the Zelda team would be able to recoup. The game itself, as I've outlined earlier, having an air to it as though it was too scared to do anything too different that could alienate the fans even more than they already did. It relied heavily on the series' past in a way that none of the earlier Zelda games ever needed to, and it was the beginning of a pattern which would last for 13 long years following this. There's this pensive shadow cast over these three games in retrospect, like they were both at the end of a less inhibited part of the series' history, and at the beginning of what many consider a cynical era of decline. Not fully in either one, though. What it was a definitive end to, however, was 2D Zelda. Well, at least 2D Zelda as it had existed. Top-down Zelda games continued to be released past this point, of course, but they began bleeding in with their 3D siblings more and more, featuring whole 3D sections and showing off that they are in fact taking place in a 3D environment, the games building their design around that. It was as a result also the end of traditional 2D sprite work in these games. Obviously, this would have happened sooner or later. It's just easier on the artists to program 3D models than to painstakingly draw out every single frame of animation on every character or effect or environment manually. But I selfishly do miss it because I just tend to prefer the way 2D sprites look when compared to 3D models. These three games, and I guess Minish Cap specifically since it was the last to be released, represent a quaint last hurrah for classic pixel art Zelda. I guess what's most interesting is just how timid of a following these games have, for Zelda games, obviously. Like, let's not mince our words here, these things are still hyper-mainstream Nintendo releases, but they're still less remembered than the rest of the series regardless. Probably because of the pivotal moment that they were released at, they ended up getting overshadowed by what came before and what came after. The games are quaint and sit comfortably in the Zelda B-side category, but it's still a shame that there wasn't more attention directed at them. Maybe not for Adventures. I think that game can stay in comparative obscurity for the rest of all time for all I care. But Four Swords and especially Minish Cap are actual solid games that more than deserve to be part of a series as beloved as this one. They're humble. I mean, they do literally make themselves small.